I'm Rebecca Daniels, 52 years old. And for 5 years I watched mediocre men get promoted while being told I was too young and needed more seasoning. But what my former boss did when I finally got the recognition I deserved was even worse. If you've ever been passed over for promotions you clearly deserved, been told you need to wait your turn while watching less qualified people advance, please let me know where you're watching from, and subscribe to join others who understand this type of professional betrayal. My career started 28 years ago in the most unlikely place, a cramped storage room converted into an office at Meridian Aerospace, a mid-sized defense contractor in Tucson. The smell of industrial adhesive and metal shavings drifted through the thin walls from the manufacturing floor, mixing with the perpetual burnt coffee aroma from the ancient breakroom percolator. I was 24, fresh out of Arizona State with an engineering degree and a head full of dreams about designing aircraft systems that would push the boundaries of what was possible. My first mentor, Dr. Sarah Chen, was a brilliant propulsion engineer who took me under her wing despite having every reason to see me as competition. She had survived 30 years in aerospace as one of the few women in senior technical roles, and she taught me that excellence wasn't just about being good at your job. It was about being undeniably, measurably better than everyone else because that was the only way they couldn't ignore you. My first big break came during the Phoenix military contract crisis of 1998, when a critical guidance system failed spectral analysis just 6 weeks before delivery deadline. While senior engineers debated sending it back to the drawing board, I spent 72 hours straight in the test lab, surviving on vending machine sandwiches and determination, until I identified a resonance frequency issue that a simple damping modification could fix. When my solution not only saved the contract but improved performance by 12%, I felt that intoxicating rush of professional recognition, the moment when you realize your brain, your training, your persistence has created something valuable that only you could have created. Over the next decade, I built my reputation one impossible project at a time. The Meridian culture rewarded innovation and technical excellence, at least in theory. I led the team that developed the adaptive wing technology that became our signature product, earned 3 patents, and published papers that established Meridian as a leader in smart aerospace materials. My teams consistently delivered projects on time and under budget while maintaining the highest quality standards in the industry. I promoted from junior engineer to project manager to senior technical director, earning the respect of colleagues who initially saw me as the ambitious young woman who asked too many questions in meetings. I learned to speak the language of aerospace engineering with fluency, understanding the difference between criticality analysis and failure mode assessment, knowing when to push back on unrealistic timelines and when to accept stretch goals that would elevate everyone's performance. The recognition felt earned and genuine. The Excellence in Engineering Award 3 years running, invitations to speak at the International Aerospace Symposium, requests from competitors trying to poach me with offers I politely declined because Meridian felt like home. My golden period peaked around 2015 when I was promoted to Director of Advanced Systems at age 41, overseeing 60 engineers across 4 departments with a budget of $45 million. The executive conference room where they offered me the position had floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Sonoran Desert, and I remember thinking this was what professional fulfillment looked like, leading brilliant people to create technology that would make aircraft safer, more efficient, more capable. My division became the profit center of the company, consistently exceeding targets while maintaining industry-leading safety records. I felt valued, secure, and optimistic about eventually moving into the VP of Engineering role when my boss Tom Hendricks retired. Colleagues sought my opinion on strategic decisions, junior engineers requested me as a mentor, and I had that rare professional satisfaction of knowing I was exactly where I belonged, doing work that mattered, surrounded by people who recognized my contributions. But corporate landscapes shift like desert weather, and the first subtle changes started when Meridian was acquired by Excelsior Defense Solutions in early 2016. The new parent company brought their own culture, their own priorities, and most significantly, their own ideas about leadership demographics. During the integration meetings, I noticed how the new executives from Excelsior seemed to listen differently when I spoke, polite attention rather than engaged interest, questions about implementation rather than vision. Tom Hendricks, who had been my strongest advocate, announced his retirement 18 months earlier than planned, citing philosophical differences with the new direction. The day that changed everything started like any other Tuesday. I arrived at 7:30 a.m., grabbed my usual dark roast from the break room that now served premium coffee in biodegradable cups instead of the old ceramic mugs, and settled into my corner office to review the quarterly engineering assessments that would determine this year's promotion cycle. The engineering management structure at Meridian had always been merit-based, at least on paper. Dr. Chen had taught me to document everything, so I had maintained detailed records of project outcomes, team performance metrics, and innovation benchmarks for every engineer in my division. The promotion discussion meeting was scheduled for 10 a.m. in Conference Room B, the one with the round table that was supposed to encourage collaborative decision-making rather than hierarchical presentations. I had spent the weekend preparing comprehensive evaluations for 12 engineers who deserved advancement, including 3 women and 2 engineers of color who had consistently exceeded performance expectations. The company culture had always prided itself on recognizing talent regardless of demographics, though I had noticed that most senior leadership still looked remarkably similar. White men between 45 and 65, who had worked their way up through traditional aerospace career paths. What made Meridian different from typical defense contractors was our commitment to innovation over politics. Engineers advanced based on technical contributions, project leadership, and measurable results rather than who they knew or how well they played golf with executives. At least, that had been true under the previous ownership. The new Excelsior leadership brought different priorities, emphasizing cultural fit and leadership potential in ways that seemed coded for characteristics that had nothing to do with engineering excellence. I had started noticing subtle changes in how meetings were conducted, how decisions were communicated, and which voices seemed to carry more weight in strategic discussions. The office environment reflected these shifting dynamics. The open floor plan that had once encouraged collaboration between departments now felt like a surveillance system, where every conversation could be monitored and evaluated. The new corporate policies emphasized alignment with company values without clearly defining what those values were, creating an atmosphere where people second-guessed their natural professional instincts. Coffee conversations became more guarded, project discussions more formal, and the easy camaraderie that had made Meridian feel like a place where engineering excellence was truly valued began to evaporate. Walking into that conference room at 10 a.m., carrying my laptop and the promotion files I had so carefully prepared, I had no idea I was about to discover just how dramatically everything had changed. The smell of new leather from the recently upgraded furniture mixed with the lingering aroma of sanitizer, another post-acquisition upgrade, that somehow made the space feel less welcoming rather than more professional. Tom's replacement, David Morrison, had already been seated at the head of the table for 20 minutes, reviewing documents I hadn't seen before, surrounded by 3 Excelsior executives I recognized, but had never worked with directly. The morning sun streaming through those conference room windows created harsh shadows across the table, and I remember thinking something felt fundamentally different about this meeting before anyone even spoke. I had built my career on the belief that excellence would always be recognized, that hard work and measurable results would speak louder than office politics or demographic preferences. 28 years of success had taught me to trust the system, to believe that good companies rewarded good work, and that my track record of innovation, leadership, and profitability would continue to open doors as it always had. I was about to learn how naive that belief had become, and how quickly a career built on merit could be undermined by leaders who valued different qualities entirely. The meeting started exactly on time, with David Morrison shuffling through papers that looked suspiciously like organizational charts rather than the engineering performance evaluations I had prepared. His voice carried the tone of someone delivering pre-planned remarks rather than engaging in collaborative discussion. "Rebecca, We need to talk about the leadership pipeline in your division and how it aligns with Excelsior's long-term strategic vision. The phrase long-term strategic vision had become corporate speak for decisions that had already been made elsewhere, by people who weren't in the room and wouldn't be affected by the consequences. I opened my laptop, ready to present the comprehensive analysis that demonstrated why each of my recommended promotions would strengthen both team capability and company profitability. That's when David slid a single sheet of paper across the table, a reorganization plan that eliminated 3 senior engineering positions in my division and created 2 new strategic leadership development roles that would report directly to Excelsior executives rather than through the existing technical management structure. The paper smelled like fresh toner and corporate efficiency, and as I scanned the bullet points, I realized that none of my carefully evaluated engineers were being considered for advancement. Instead, the document outlined a plan to bring in external candidates who would bring fresh perspectives and proven leadership experience from other Excelsior divisions. The thing is, David continued, his voice carrying the practiced sympathy of someone who had delivered this message before. We need leaders who understand Excelsior's culture and can implement our proven methodologies across all technical divisions. Your team has done excellent work under the previous structure, but we need to evolve our approach to match corporate standards. The words corporate standards landed like a physical blow because I understood immediately what they meant: my 28 years of aerospace expertise, my patents, my profit-generating innovations, my team's exceptional performance. None of it mattered if it didn't fit into boxes that had been designed somewhere else by people who had never solved a resonance frequency problem or led a team through an impossible deadline. The 3 Excelsior executives nodded in synchronized agreement, their expressions professionally neutral in the way that corporate training teaches you to deliver bad news without appearing personally invested in the outcome. One of them, a woman named Patricia Wells, who served as VP of Human Capital Integration, spoke next with the measured tone of someone reciting policy rather than engaging in discussion. We've identified several high-potential candidates from our Dallas and San Diego facilities who have experience with the leadership frameworks we're implementing company-wide. They'll be able to hit the ground running and ensure consistency across all Excelsior engineering divisions. I felt my stomach drop as I realized what was happening. This wasn't a promotion discussion, it was notification of a fait accompli. The high-potential candidates were already selected, already being onboarded, already preparing to take over teams I had built and nurtured for years. My carefully documented performance evaluations, my evidence-based recommendations for advancement, my deep knowledge of every project and every engineer in my division, all of it was being dismissed as irrelevant to the new corporate structure. What about the engineers in my division who have been developing toward these leadership roles? I asked, trying to keep my voice level and professional, despite the growing realization that this meeting was theater rather than decision-making. Jennifer Hawkins has been managing the Phoenix contract flawlessly for 18 months, and Marcus Rodriguez's innovation in materials testing has saved us over $2 million this fiscal year. They've earned these opportunities. David's response revealed the depth of the transformation taking place. Those are exactly the kinds of technical contributions we value, and they'll continue to be crucial in their current roles. But leadership requires different skill sets: strategic thinking, change management, cross-divisional collaboration. We need people who can see the bigger picture beyond individual projects. The implication was clear. I and my team were being categorized as technical specialists who lacked the broader business acumen necessary for real leadership, despite years of evidence to the contrary. The meeting continued for another 45 minutes, but the essential message had been delivered in those first 10. The Meridian I had joined as an eager young engineer, where technical excellence and innovation were the primary currencies of advancement, was being systematically dismantled and replaced with a corporate structure that valued alignment over achievement, conformity over creativity. My division would be reorganized, my team would be reassigned, and my role would be evolved to focus on technical excellence rather than strategic leadership, a demotion disguised as organizational optimization. Walking back to my office, the familiar hallways felt different. The photographs of successful project launches and team celebrations that lined the walls seemed like artifacts from a different era, reminders of a culture that was being methodically erased. I sat at my desk, staring at the quarterly performance reports that demonstrated unequivocally that my division was the most profitable and innovative in the company, wondering how excellence had become irrelevant so quickly. The desert sun streaming through my office window illuminated dust particles dancing in the air, and I remember thinking they looked like the remnants of something that had been broken apart, scattered, and could never quite be put back together the same way. That afternoon, I did what Dr. Chen had taught me to do when facing professional challenges. I started documenting everything. I made copies of every performance evaluation, every project outcome report, every email that demonstrated the success and profitability of my division. I had no idea yet that I was gathering evidence for a battle I didn't even know was coming, but instinct told me that truth would eventually matter, even if it didn't seem to matter right now. The corporate transformation was just beginning, and I was about to discover that being passed over for promotion was only the first move in a much larger game. The gaslighting started during my next meeting with David Morrison, 3 weeks after the reorganization announcement. He had requested what he called a calibration session to discuss my adjustment to the new leadership structure, and to ensure we're aligned on expectations moving forward. The conference room was the same one where my career trajectory had been quietly redirected, but this time David had come prepared with a different kind of ammunition, revisionist history disguised as performance feedback. "Rebecca, I want to make sure you understand that this transition isn't about your technical capabilities," he began, arranging papers on the table with the deliberate precision of someone building a case. "Your engineering skills are solid, and your project management has been adequate. But leadership at Excelsior requires a broader perspective, and we've identified some areas where your approach hasn't quite aligned with corporate best practices." The word adequate hit like a slap. 28 years of engineering excellence, 3 patents, millions in cost savings, and multiple industry awards had just been reduced to adequate by someone who had been at Meridian for 6 months. Patricia Wells from Human Capital Integration was there again, this time with a manila folder containing what she described as 360-degree feedback from colleagues and subordinates. "We've been conducting informal interviews with your team members and stakeholders," she explained, opening the folder to reveal carefully typed summaries that I was not allowed to read directly. "While people respect your technical knowledge, there are some concerns about communication style and adaptability to change." She quoted selectively from anonymous feedback that painted me as rigid, overly detail-oriented, and resistant to new corporate initiatives. The most insidious part was how they mixed legitimate observations with damaging interpretations. Yes, I was detail-oriented. That's what had prevented costly engineering failures for years. Yes, I had questioned some of the new corporate initiatives because they contradicted proven technical practices and threatened project quality. But in their retelling, these strengths became weaknesses, and my professional judgment became evidence of inflexibility. David nodded sympathetically as Patricia spoke, as if he genuinely regretted having to deliver such disappointing news about my performance. "The feedback suggests that your teams sometimes feel micromanaged," Patricia continued, "and that you tend to focus on tactical execution rather than strategic vision." I knew this was fabricated because I had just completed our annual team satisfaction survey, where my leadership style had received consistently high ratings for providing clear direction while allowing technical autonomy. But they had my responses to their carefully framed questions, and I had no access to the actual feedback they claimed to have collected. I requested specific examples and documentation, which prompted an exchange of glances between David and Patricia that I was clearly meant to notice. "That's exactly the kind of response that concerns us," David said with practiced patience. "This defensive posture, this need to challenge every piece of feedback suggests difficulty accepting guidance and adapting to corporate culture. We're trying to help you understand how to succeed in the new structure, but you seem more interested in proving us wrong than in growing professionally." The circular logic was maddening and deliberate. Asking for evidence of poor performance was itself treated as evidence of poor performance. Defending my track record was characterized as defensiveness. Requesting clarity about expectations was interpreted as resistance to change. Every response I gave was somehow confirmation of the problems they were describing, creating an impossible situation where silence looked like admission and engagement looked like defiance. They had obviously been trained in this approach because their tag team delivery was too smooth to be improvised. David would present criticism dressed as concern. Patricia would provide pseudo-data that supported predetermined conclusions, and together they created an atmosphere where my 28 years of success became a liability rather than an asset. The meeting ended with David assigning me to work with an executive coach to develop the leadership competencies that will help you thrive in our evolving organization. But the real revelation came 2 days later when I ran into Jennifer Hawkins in the parking lot after work. Jennifer had been one of my most promising engineers, someone I had been grooming for senior project management. And her expression when she saw me was a mixture of guilt and anger that immediately told me something was wrong. "Rebecca, I need you to know that I never said those things," she said, glancing around the empty parking lot as if corporate security might be monitoring our conversation. "What things?" I asked. Though I was already beginning to understand. "They interviewed me last week about your management style," Jennifer explained, her voice barely above a whisper. "They asked leading questions about whether I felt I had enough autonomy, whether I thought you trusted the team to make decisions, whether I felt prepared for leadership roles. I gave positive answers, but they kept rephrasing the questions like they were looking for different responses. Then they asked about specific incidents that never happened, like times when you allegedly overruled team decisions or excluded people from important meetings." Jennifer's revelation shattered the last of my naivety about corporate political warfare. They weren't just reinterpreting my performance, they were manufacturing evidence to support predetermined conclusions. The 360-degree feedback wasn't based on actual interviews with my team, it was based on carefully constructed questions designed to elicit responses that could be selectively quoted and recontextualized to build a case for my incompetence. "They're doing this to other people too," Jennifer continued. "Marcus told me they asked him about whether he felt you gave him enough credit for his innovations, and when he said you always ensured his work was properly recognized, they asked whether he thought you might be threatened by his success. It was like they were trying to plant ideas rather than collect feedback." That night, I sat in my home office surrounded by performance reviews, project reports, and industry recognition letters that told a completely different story about my leadership and professional capabilities. The contrast between documented reality and corporate narrative was so stark it would have been laughable if my career wasn't being systematically dismantled. I was beginning to understand that this wasn't about performance improvement or organizational optimization. It was about creating justification for decisions that had already been made for reasons they couldn't admit publicly. The isolation campaign began subtly, the way most professional assassinations do. It started with small changes that could easily be explained as organizational efficiency rather than deliberate exclusion. The Monday morning leadership team meetings that I had attended for 7 years were suddenly restructured to focus on strategic initiatives that didn't require input from operational directors. My calendar invitations to quarterly planning sessions were quietly removed, with David Morrison's assistant explaining that they were streamlining participation to essential stakeholders. Project status meetings for contracts I had managed for years were rescheduled to times when I had unmovable technical reviews, and when I requested agenda items or updates, I was told the information would be disseminated through appropriate channels. The technological aspects of isolation were particularly insidious because they could be attributed to system upgrades and security protocols rather than intentional sabotage. My access to the executive SharePoint folder was revoked during a security audit that somehow affected only my credentials. Email distribution lists were updated to exclude my address from strategic communications, and when I inquired about missing information, I was told there had been system glitches that were being worked on by IT. My keycard access to the executive conference rooms was downgraded without notification, leading to the humiliating experience of standing outside conference room while David Morrison and the Excelsior team conducted meetings about projects in my division. The most devastating part was watching my former allies distance themselves with the practiced neutrality of people who had decided which way the political winds were blowing. Colleagues who had sought my advice for years suddenly became too busy to return phone calls or discuss technical challenges that had previously been routine collaborations. The informal network of relationships that makes any organization actually function, the quick conversations in hallways, the collaborative problem-solving sessions, the mutual support that helps teams exceed their individual capabilities, began to evaporate as people calculated the professional risk of being associated with someone who was clearly out of favor. Marcus Rodriguez, one of my most talented engineers, stopped by my office one Thursday afternoon, with the nervous energy of someone delivering bad news they didn't want to deliver. "Rebecca, I think you should know that they're asking questions about project decisions you made 2 years ago," he said, closing my office door behind him with unusual care. Patricia Wells scheduled individual meetings with everyone on our team to discuss process improvement opportunities, but the questions were all about your leadership during the Falcon missile guidance contract. The Falcon contract had been one of our most successful projects, delivered 3 months early and 15% under budget while exceeding all performance specifications. But Marcus explained that the questioning focused on moments when I had overruled initial design approaches that later proved ineffective, decisions that had ultimately saved the project but were now being reframed as evidence of authoritarian management style. They wanted to know if you had listened to alternative viewpoints, if you had explained your reasoning, if you had made people feel heard even when you disagreed with their approaches. "What did you tell them?" I asked, though I was beginning to understand that the specific content of Marcus's responses mattered less than the fact that the investigation was happening at all. "I told them the truth that you saved that contract by recognizing the design flaw that the rest of us missed, and that your decision-making process was exactly what senior technical leadership should look like. But they seemed more interested in whether I felt comfortable disagreeing with you than in whether your decisions had been correct." Marcus paused, looking out my office window toward the manufacturing floor where the systems we had designed were being assembled into aircraft that would serve for decades. "The thing is, Rebecca, I got the impression they weren't looking for information. They were looking for confirmation of something they already believed." That afternoon I discovered that my project files were being audited by a team of external consultants who had been granted access to confidential technical documents without my knowledge. When I inquired about the audit scope and timeline, David Morrison explained that Excelsior was conducting routine quality assurance reviews across all technical divisions to ensure compliance with corporate standards. But the audit was clearly focused on identifying irregularities or questionable decisions that could support the narrative they were building about my leadership capabilities. The quality of my work was becoming irrelevant in a system designed to find fault regardless of actual performance. Every decision I had made, every project I had led, every innovation I had championed was being re-examined through the lens of predetermined conclusions about my unsuitability for leadership. The engineering excellence that had built my reputation was being recontextualized as evidence of my limitations, and the very achievements that had earned respect and recognition were now being used as weapons against me. By December, 6 months after the reorganization announcement, I was effectively managing my division through intermediaries while being excluded from the strategic decisions that affected every aspect of our work. My team was confused and demoralized, caught between loyalty to a leader who had consistently supported their professional development and pressure from new management that was clearly orchestrating my marginalization. The engineering work continued, but the collaborative culture that had made us successful was being systematically destroyed by corporate politics that had nothing to do with technical excellence or business results. The setup came in January, disguised as an opportunity for redemption. David Morrison scheduled what he called a reset meeting to discuss my path forward within the new organizational structure. Patricia Wells was there again, this time accompanied by a corporate lawyer whose presence was explained as standard procedure for performance planning discussions. The conference room had been rearranged with a small table and 4 chairs, creating an intimate setting that felt more like an interrogation than a collaborative planning session. "Rebecca, we want to give you every opportunity to succeed in this transition," David began, his tone carrying the kind of manufactured sympathy that immediately signals impending bad news. But we need to see dramatic improvement in specific areas, and we need to see it quickly. He slid a document across the table titled Performance Improvement Plan that outlined expectations so detailed and contradictory that failure was essentially guaranteed. The plan required me to demonstrate enhanced strategic thinking while simultaneously improving operational execution. I was expected to build stronger collaborative relationships with the Excelsior executives who had been systematically excluding me from strategic discussions, while also showing greater independence and initiative in developing solutions to problems I was no longer allowed to fully understand. The timeline was 90 days, with formal evaluations every 30 days based on criteria that were subjective and unmeasurable. But the real trap was buried in the specifics. The plan required me to lead a cross-divisional integration project that would demonstrate my ability to work effectively within Excelsior's corporate culture. The project involved coordinating with teams in Dallas and San Diego to standardize manufacturing processes across all facilities, a legitimate business objective that would typically require 12 to 18 months of careful technical analysis and gradual implementation. I was given 90 days, and a budget that was insufficient for the travel and consultation necessary to do the work properly. Patricia Wells presented this impossible assignment as a developmental opportunity. This project will give you the chance to showcase your strategic leadership capabilities and build relationships with colleagues across the Excelsior network, she explained, as if the timeline and resource constraints were motivational challenges rather than deliberate sabotage. Success here will demonstrate that you can operate effectively at the enterprise level and think beyond the limitations of a single facility. The corporate lawyer, introduced as Thomas Bradley from Excelsior's Legal Affairs Division, was there to ensure I understood the consequences of failing to meet the performance plan requirements. "We want to be completely transparent about expectations and outcomes," he said, with the measured precision of someone who wrote disclaimers for a living. "This plan represents a significant investment in your professional development, and we need to see measurable progress within the specified timeframes. Failure to achieve the outlined objectives will necessarily trigger further performance management actions." I understood immediately that this was a termination process disguised as professional development. The performance plan was designed to create documented evidence of my inability to meet corporate expectations, providing legal justification for whatever action they intended to take. The impossible timeline, insufficient resources, and contradictory requirements ensured that failure was inevitable, regardless of my effort or capability. But I also realized that they needed my cooperation to make this charade legitimate. They needed me to sign the performance improvement plan, to acknowledge the validity of their concerns, to participate in my own professional destruction. If I refused to sign, they would characterize that as further evidence of my inability to accept feedback and work collaboratively. If I signed and inevitably failed to meet impossible requirements, they would have documentation that I had been given every opportunity to succeed. "I need time to review this thoroughly before I can respond," I said, buying myself the weekend to consult with the employment attorney that Jennifer Hawkins had quietly recommended through a mutual friend who worked at a different aerospace company. This represents a significant shift in my role and responsibilities, and I want to make sure I understand all the implications before I commit to the plan. David's response revealed the pressure they were under to complete this process quickly. "Of course, but we need your decision by Monday. The project timeline doesn't allow for extended deliberation, and we need to know if you're prepared to embrace this opportunity, or if we need to consider alternative approaches." The phrase "alternative approaches" was clearly meant to sound like a threat, and the artificial urgency was designed to prevent me from seeking outside counsel or fully understanding my options. That weekend, I met with attorney Sarah Kim in her downtown Tucson office, bringing copies of every document, email, and performance evaluation I had collected over the past 8 months. Sarah specialized in employment law with particular expertise in executive termination cases, and she listened to my story with the kind of focused attention that immediately told me she had seen this pattern before. They're following a very specific playbook, Sarah explained after reviewing my documentation. Create a paper trail that suggests performance problems, isolate you from normal business operations, then offer a performance improvement plan with impossible requirements. When you inevitably fail to meet those requirements, they have legal justification for termination and protection against wrongful dismissal claims. She paused, studying the timeline I had constructed of corporate actions since the acquisition. The question is whether they're doing this because they want you gone for legitimate business reasons they can't articulate publicly, or because they're clearing space for specific people they want to install in leadership positions. Sarah's analysis crystallized what I had been sensing but couldn't quite formulate. This wasn't really about my performance or capabilities. This was about corporate restructuring that required the removal of existing leaders who didn't fit the demographic or cultural profile that Excelsior preferred for senior positions. My technical excellence, my track record of innovation, my team's exceptional performance, none of it mattered because the decision to remove me had been made for reasons that had nothing to do with merit. The good news, Sarah continued, is that they're being so systematic about building their case that they're creating evidence of their own discriminatory intent. The timing, the impossible requirements, the manufactured performance issues, it's all documentation that you were targeted for removal rather than legitimately coached for improvement. She recommended that I sign the performance improvement plan, but with a carefully worded response that preserved my legal options while appearing to cooperate with their process. Monday morning I walked into David Morrison's office with a 2-page response that acknowledged the performance plan while raising questions about resource allocation, timeline feasibility, and success metrics. I had Sarah Kim's business card in my wallet and a digital recorder in my briefcase, and for the first time in months, I felt like I had some measure of control over my professional destiny. The corporate game was rigged, but at least now I understood the rules and had begun preparing my own strategy for playing it. The ultimatum came on a Friday afternoon in March, delivered with the kind of corporate theater that was clearly designed to emphasize power dynamics rather than facilitate genuine communication. David Morrison's assistant had scheduled a transition planning meeting for 4:30 p.m., ensuring that it would be the last business of the week and that I would have the weekend to process the conversation and consider my options. The conference room was arranged with Patricia Wells and Thomas Bradley flanking David at one end of the table, while a single chair was positioned at the opposite end, a staging that would have been laughably obvious if my career wasn't being held hostage. "Rebecca, I think we all hoped this conversation would go differently," David began, his voice carrying the practiced regret of someone who had delivered this script before. "But after reviewing your progress on the integration project and consulting with stakeholders across the organization, we've reached the conclusion that this isn't the right fit for either party." He slid a manila envelope across the table with the kind of ceremonial precision that suggested this moment had been choreographed well in advance. The envelope contained a separation agreement that was clearly the product of extensive legal preparation. They were offering 18 months of salary continuation, extended health benefits, and a significant cash payment in exchange for a comprehensive non-disclosure agreement and a waiver of all potential legal claims against Excelsior and Meridian. The numbers were substantial enough to suggest they understood the legal vulnerability of their position, but the terms were designed to ensure my permanent silence about everything I had witnessed and experienced. Patricia Wells took over the presentation with the smooth efficiency of someone who specialized in corporate terminations disguised as mutual agreements. "We've structured this package to provide you with significant financial security while you explore your next career opportunity," she explained, opening her own copy of the agreement to reference specific sections. "The 18-month salary continuation is substantially more generous than standard severance, and the additional compensation reflects our appreciation for your years of service and our desire to ensure a smooth transition." But the real message was delivered by Thomas Bradley, whose presence made clear that this was a legal negotiation rather than a personnel discussion. "The agreement includes standard confidentiality provisions that protect both parties' interests," he said, his tone carrying the unmistakable implication that refusing these terms would trigger consequences I wouldn't enjoy. It's important to understand that accepting this package represents a clean break that allows everyone to move forward without ongoing complications or misunderstandings. The phrase ongoing complications was obviously legal code for potential litigation, and Bradley's emphasis made clear that they were offering money to prevent me from telling my story publicly or challenging their actions through the courts. The non-disclosure agreement was comprehensive, prohibiting me from discussing my experiences at Meridian or Excelsior with potential employers, industry colleagues, media representatives, or anyone else who might use the information in ways that could damage corporate reputations. I read through the agreement carefully while they watched, noting the clauses that would prevent me from warning other professionals about the corporate culture I had experienced or advising potential acquisitions targets about Excelsior's management practices. The document was thorough enough to suggest they were concerned about multiple potential sources of exposure, not just employment law violations, but broader patterns of behavior that could create public relations problems or regulatory scrutiny. "I need time to review this with my attorney," I said, closing the folder and maintaining eye contact with David, despite the obvious effort to intimidate me into immediate compliance. This represents a significant life decision, and I'm not prepared to make that kind of commitment without proper legal counsel. David's response revealed the timeline pressure they were operating under. "Of course. But I should mention that this offer expires at close of business on Wednesday. Beyond that point, we'll need to pursue standard termination procedures, which would obviously result in a much less favorable outcome for everyone involved." The artificial deadline was clearly designed to prevent thorough legal review, but it also suggested that they needed this situation resolved quickly, for reasons that probably had nothing to do with my individual case. Additionally, Patricia Wells added, "We should mention that we've already identified your replacement for the Director of Advanced Systems position. Jennifer Hawkins will be transitioning into an interim role while we conduct a formal search for permanent leadership. We wanted you to hear that from us directly, rather than through office rumors." The revelation that Jennifer was being promoted into my position was clearly intended to sting, but it actually confirmed what I had suspected about their timeline and priorities. That weekend, I spent 8 hours in Sarah Kim's office, analyzing every clause of the separation agreement and developing a comprehensive strategy for protecting my interests while exposing the systemic problems I had witnessed. Sarah had been researching Excelsior's acquisition history and had discovered a pattern of similar executive departures at other companies they had purchased. "You're not the first senior technical leader they've removed using these tactics," she explained, showing me news articles and LinkedIn profiles that told remarkably similar stories of experienced professionals being marginalized and eliminated after acquisitions. "The question," Sarah continued, "is whether you want to take their money and disappear quietly, or whether you want to fight this publicly and potentially help other people avoid similar treatment." She had identified 3 other aerospace professionals who had been terminated by Excelsior under questionable circumstances, and she believed a coordinated legal challenge could expose patterns of discriminatory behavior that individual cases couldn't establish. But she also warned me about the personal costs of refusing their offer. "They're clearly prepared to make your life difficult if you don't cooperate," Sarah explained. "The threats about references and industry reputation aren't empty. They have enough influence in aerospace to create real problems for your career prospects. And fighting them publicly will require a significant investment of time, money, and emotional energy with no guarantee of success." Monday morning, I walked into David Morrison's office with a counter-proposal that I knew they would reject, but that would create a legal record of their unwillingness to negotiate in good faith. I offered to accept a modified separation agreement that included the financial package but eliminated the non-disclosure provisions, allowing me to discuss my experiences truthfully while agreeing not to make false or defamatory statements about the company. Their response was swift and predictable. "The confidentiality provisions aren't negotiable," Thomas Bradley explained with the cold precision of someone who was accustomed to getting his way through intimidation. "The entire package is contingent on your agreement to maintain complete confidentiality about your employment experiences and the circumstances of your departure." That's when I realized they weren't just trying to get rid of me. They were trying to prevent me from becoming a witness to their systematic transformation of Meridian's culture. They needed my silence not just about my own treatment, but about the broader changes I had observed, the other professionals who had been marginalized, and the corporate practices that prioritized political alignment over technical excellence. In that case, I said, standing up and returning the unsigned agreement to David's desk, I'll need to decline your offer and pursue my legal options through appropriate channels. The room fell silent for a moment as they processed the reality that their carefully orchestrated termination process wasn't going to end with my quiet cooperation. Patricia Wells made one final attempt at intimidation. I hope you understand the implications of that decision, Rebecca. Excelsior has significant resources and influence in the aerospace industry. Choosing litigation over a generous settlement could have long-term consequences for your professional reputation and career prospects. I understand completely, I replied, meeting her gaze with the confidence that comes from finally understanding exactly what kind of fight you're in. And I'm prepared to accept those consequences rather than allow this behavior to continue unchallenged. Walking out of that conference room for the last time, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months, the satisfaction of standing up for principles that mattered more than personal convenience or financial security. They had expected me to be intimidated by their power, and grateful for their money, but they had miscalculated the resolve of someone who had spent 28 years building a reputation based on integrity and excellence. The confrontation came 3 months later in a conference room that felt more like a courtroom than a corporate meeting space. The neutral venue was the law offices of Hartman and Associates, chosen by mutual agreement for the mediation that both sides hoped would resolve my wrongful termination claim without the publicity and expense of a full trial. The morning sun streamed through floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked downtown Phoenix, casting harsh shadows across a mahogany table where the future of my career and Excelsior's liability would be determined by documents, witnesses, and the careful presentation of evidence that had taken months to assemble. David Morrison and Patricia Wells sat with their legal team on one side of the table, their expressions professionally neutral in the way that corporate executives learn to mask anxiety during high-stakes negotiations. Thomas Bradley was flanked by 2 additional attorneys from Excelsior's National Legal Department, their presence indicating that this case had escalated far beyond a routine personnel dispute. Across from them, Sarah Kim had assembled her own team, including an employment law specialist from Phoenix and a corporate accountability expert, whose expertise in acquisition-related discrimination cases had earned national recognition. The mediator, retired federal judge Patricia Hernandez, reviewed the case summary with the methodical precision of someone who had adjudicated thousands of corporate disputes and could recognize patterns of behavior that individual participants might miss. Before we begin formal presentations, she announced, I want to establish that this mediation represents each party's opportunity to present their strongest case without the constraints of formal discovery or the unpredictability of jury trial. Whatever happens here today will determine how this matter proceeds. Excelsior's lead attorney Margaret Foster opened with the polished presentation of someone who specialized in defending corporations against employee claims. Your Honor, this case represents an unfortunate misunderstanding about standard corporate restructuring following an acquisition, she began, arranging exhibits that portrayed my termination as part of routine organizational optimization rather than targeted discrimination. Ms. Daniels was an accomplished technical professional, but technical excellence and executive leadership require different skill sets, and the evidence will show that she struggled to adapt to the broader strategic requirements of her evolved role. For the next 45 minutes, Foster presented a carefully constructed narrative that acknowledged my engineering capabilities while systematically undermining my claims of discriminatory treatment. She emphasized the performance improvement plan as evidence of Excelsior's good faith effort to help me succeed, the integration project as a legitimate test of strategic leadership capabilities, and my ultimate failure to meet requirements as proof that the termination was justified by performance rather than bias. But Sarah Kim had spent months preparing for exactly this presentation, and her response dismantled Foster's arguments with the precision of someone who understood both the legal framework and the corporate tactics being employed. Your Honor, the evidence will demonstrate that Ms. Daniels was not terminated for performance reasons, but was systematically excluded from normal business operations, and then given impossible assignments designed to justify predetermined conclusions about her leadership capabilities. Sarah's presentation focused on the timeline and documentation that revealed the deliberate nature of my isolation and marginalization. She presented email records showing that I was excluded from strategic meetings while decisions were made about my division, performance evaluations that demonstrated consistent excellence right up until the acquisition, and testimony from current and former Meridian employees that contradicted the corporate narrative about my leadership style and professional capabilities. The turning point came when Sarah introduced evidence that Excelsior's legal team clearly hadn't expected us to obtain. Through discovery requests and industry contacts, she had identified patterns of similar treatment at other companies Excelsior had acquired. Your Honor, we have documentation showing that Miss Daniels's experience was not an isolated incident, but part of a systematic approach to removing senior technical leaders who don't fit Excelsior's preferred demographic and cultural profile. Foster's objection was immediate and forceful. That evidence is irrelevant to this individual case and represents an inappropriate attempt to introduce prejudicial information about unrelated corporate decisions. But Judge Hernandez allowed the presentation to continue, recognizing that patterns of behavior across multiple acquisitions could indicate discriminatory intent that might not be apparent in individual cases. The evidence was devastating. Sarah presented documentation of 12 senior technical professionals at 6 different acquired companies who had been terminated or forced to resign within 18 months of Excelsior acquisitions. The pattern was consistent. Experienced leaders were marginalized through exclusion from strategic decisions, given impossible performance requirements, and ultimately removed despite track records of technical excellence and business success. What's particularly significant, Sarah explained, is that in every case these technical leaders were replaced by executives from Excelsior's existing divisions rather than through competitive hiring processes. This suggests that the terminations were driven by predetermined staffing decisions rather than performance concerns. She presented organizational charts showing that the high-potential candidates brought in to replace terminated leaders were overwhelmingly men between 45 and 60 who had spent their entire careers within Excelsior's corporate culture. But the smoking gun was a series of internal emails that Sarah had obtained through a former Excelsior executive who had become disgusted with the company's practices and was willing to testify about systematic discrimination. The emails, written by senior Excelsior leaders during acquisition planning, explicitly discussed the need to reshape technical leadership and ensure cultural alignment at all management levels. One particularly damaging email referred to the need to move quickly on personnel changes before existing leaders become entrenched in new structures. David Morrison's face went white as Sarah read excerpts from emails that revealed the acquisition process included predetermined plans for replacing senior technical leadership, regardless of performance or business results. Patricia Wells tried to maintain her professional composure, but her body language indicated that she was hearing some of this evidence for the first time and was beginning to understand the legal exposure her company faced. Judge Hernandez called a recess to allow both sides to confer with their clients about the implications of the evidence presented. During the 30-minute break, I watched through the conference room windows as Excelsior's legal team engaged in heated conversations that occasionally rose to the level of visible argument. Sarah used the time to prepare for what she anticipated would be immediate settlement negotiations rather than continued litigation. When proceedings resumed, Margaret Foster's tone had shifted from confident advocacy to damage control negotiation. Your Honor, while my client maintains that Miss Daniels' termination was justified by legitimate business considerations, we recognize that extended litigation would be costly and time-consuming for all parties. We're prepared to discuss resolution terms that would address Miss Daniels' concerns while allowing Excelsior to move forward with its business operations. But Sarah had no intention of allowing them to buy their way out of accountability with money alone. Your Honor, this case was never just about my client's individual treatment. It was about exposing systematic discrimination that affects the entire aerospace industry. Any resolution must include acknowledgement of wrongdoing and commitments to change corporate practices that target experienced professionals for elimination. The negotiation that followed was unlike anything I had imagined when I first decided to fight rather than accept their severance package. Sarah demanded not just financial compensation, but corporate policy changes, diversity monitoring, and external oversight of Excelsior's future acquisition practices. She wanted the settlement to include provisions that would protect other professionals from experiencing what I had endured. Judge Hernandez facilitated these discussions with the expertise of someone who understood that truly successful mediation creates systemic change rather than just resolving individual disputes. The evidence presented today suggests problems that extend beyond this single case, she observed. Any resolution should address both the individual harm suffered by Ms. Daniels and the broader corporate practices that enabled that harm. The final settlement exceeded anything I had hoped for when this process began. Beyond substantial financial compensation, Excelsior agreed to policy changes that would require transparent performance evaluation processes, external monitoring of post-acquisition personnel decisions, and annual diversity reporting for all senior technical positions. They also agreed to fund an industry fellowship program for experienced aerospace professionals who had faced discrimination, creating opportunities for people whose careers had been damaged by corporate politics. Most importantly, the settlement included a limited waiver of confidentiality provisions that would allow me to discuss my experiences publicly for educational and advocacy purposes. While I couldn't reveal specific financial details or make defamatory statements, I would be able to tell my story to warn other professionals about discriminatory practices and help them recognize the early warning signs of systematic exclusion. Walking out of that conference room, I felt a satisfaction that went far beyond personal vindication. The evidence we had presented would make it much more difficult for Excelsior to continue their discriminatory practices, and the policy changes would provide protection for professionals who found themselves in similar situations. The corporate accountability that had seemed impossible when I was sitting alone in my office, excluded from meetings and marginalized from decisions, had become reality through careful documentation, legal expertise, and the courage to fight rather than accept convenient silence. The immediate aftermath of the settlement created a strange period of professional limbo that I hadn't anticipated. While I was vindicated legally and financially compensated for the discrimination I had experienced, I was also unemployed in an industry where word travels quickly and corporate reputations can determine career prospects. The settlement agreement prohibited Excelsior from making negative statements about my performance or character, but it couldn't prevent the subtle forms of industry blacklisting that occur when powerful companies want to discourage other potential employers from hiring someone who has challenged corporate authority. The first few weeks were a mixture of relief and uncertainty. Relief that the legal battle was over, and that I had resources to take time choosing my next career move. Uncertainty about whether the aerospace industry would view me as a whistleblower to be avoided or a professional worth hiring for my technical expertise and leadership experience. Sarah Kim had warned me that fighting corporate discrimination publicly often comes with professional costs that extend far beyond the immediate case, and I was beginning to understand what that meant in practical terms. The industry response was mixed and revealing. Several senior aerospace executives reached out privately to express support for my actions and share their own experiences with corporate discrimination and questionable acquisition practices. These conversations confirmed that my experience at Meridian wasn't unique, and that many experienced professionals had witnessed similar systematic exclusion of senior technical leaders who didn't fit new ownership's preferred demographics or cultural profiles. But I also discovered that some companies were reluctant to interview someone who had successfully challenged wrongful termination, regardless of the merits of the case. 3 potential opportunities disappeared after initial expressions of interest, with human resources departments citing concerns about cultural fit or questions about long-term commitment that were clearly code for discomfort with my legal history. The message was subtle but clear. Professionals who stand up for their rights even when they're legally vindicated can become too risky to hire in an industry where corporate relationships matter more than individual justice. The turning point came when I was contacted by Elena Rodriguez, CEO of Pinnacle Aerospace Systems, a mid-sized defense contractor that specialized in advanced materials research. Elena had followed my case through industry publications and legal newsletters, and she was looking for someone with my technical background to lead their new smart materials division. "Rebecca, what happened to you at Meridian could happen to any of us," she said, during our first phone conversation. "But what you did about it shows exactly the kind of leadership and integrity I want in my senior team." Pinnacle was different from the traditional aerospace giants where I had spent my career. Founded 15 years earlier by three engineers who had left established companies to pursue innovative approaches to materials science, Pinnacle had grown by focusing on technical excellence rather than corporate politics. The company culture emphasized collaborative problem-solving, transparent communication, and merit-based advancement, values that had become so rare in my experience that they felt almost revolutionary. Elena offered me the position of Vice President of Advanced Materials, with responsibility for building a division that would develop next-generation aerospace applications for smart materials technology. The role combined technical leadership with business development, requiring me to work directly with military and commercial customers while managing a team of researchers and engineers who were pushing the boundaries of what was possible in materials science. More importantly, Elena made clear that my experience fighting corporate discrimination was viewed as an asset rather than a liability. "We're a company that succeeds because we value diversity of thought and experience," she explained. "Someone who has the courage to stand up for principles when it's difficult and expensive is exactly the kind of leader we need." The conversation was refreshing because it focused on what I could contribute rather than what risks I might represent. 6 months after joining Pinnacle, I was leading a team of 23 engineers and researchers who were developing materials that could adapt their properties in response to environmental conditions. The technology had applications in everything from aircraft wings that could optimize their shape for different flight conditions to protective equipment that could respond automatically to chemical or biological threats. The work was challenging and meaningful, the kind of engineering that had originally drawn me to aerospace, because it combined technical innovation with practical applications that could save lives and improve performance. But the real satisfaction came from creating the kind of workplace culture that I had missed during my final years at Meridian. My team meetings were collaborative discussions where junior engineers could challenge senior decisions and where the best ideas were recognized regardless of who proposed them. Performance evaluations were based on measurable contributions to project success rather than subjective assessments of cultural fit, and advancement opportunities were available to anyone who demonstrated technical excellence and leadership potential. The legal settlement with Excelsior had also created unexpected opportunities for industry advocacy and corporate accountability work. The fellowship program we had negotiated was funding research and development projects led by experienced aerospace professionals who had faced discrimination, creating innovations that might never have emerged under traditional corporate structures. I was invited to speak at industry conferences about workplace discrimination and corporate accountability, sharing lessons learned and helping other professionals recognize warning signs of systematic exclusion. 1 year after the settlement, I received a phone call that validated everything I had fought for. Dr. Jennifer Hawkins, who had been promoted into my former position at Meridian, was calling to discuss opportunities at Pinnacle. "Rebecca, the culture at Meridian has become impossible," she explained. "The Excelsior management style has destroyed the collaborative environment that made us successful, and most of the senior technical staff are looking for other opportunities." Jennifer's description of conditions at Meridian confirmed what I had suspected about the long-term consequences of Excelsior's corporate practices. Technical excellence was being subordinated to political alignment, innovation was being stifled by bureaucratic processes, and the engineering culture that had made Meridian successful was being systematically dismantled. The division I had built was struggling to meet contract commitments, and several major projects were experiencing cost overruns and technical problems that could have been avoided with proper technical leadership. "The irony," Jennifer continued, "is that they're starting to realize they need people with your expertise and leadership style, but they've created an environment where those people don't want to work there." She paused, and I could hear the frustration in her voice. They removed the leaders who could make them successful, and now they're discovering that political loyalty can't substitute for technical competence. 3 months later, Jennifer joined Pinnacle as Director of Systems Integration, bringing with her 2 other senior engineers from Meridian, who had become disillusioned with Excelsior's management approach. Within 6 months, our team had developed a materials technology breakthrough that attracted major contracts from aerospace manufacturers who were looking for innovative solutions rather than incremental improvements to existing approaches. The professional healing that had seemed impossible during my darkest months at Meridian had become not just achievable but deeply satisfying. Working at Pinnacle reminded me why I had chosen aerospace engineering as a career: the intellectual challenge of solving complex technical problems, the satisfaction of creating systems that would perform reliably in demanding environments, and the collaboration with brilliant colleagues who shared a commitment to excellence and innovation. 2 years after my legal victory, the industry impact of our settlement became clear through changes that extended far beyond Excelsior's corporate policies. The external monitoring provisions had created accountability mechanisms that other aerospace companies began adopting voluntarily, recognizing that transparent personnel practices were becoming competitive advantages in attracting and retaining top technical talent. The diversity reporting requirements had established benchmarks that industry organizations were using to evaluate corporate culture and leadership development. Most significantly, the case had created legal precedent that made systematic discrimination much more expensive and risky for corporate acquisition strategies. Employment attorneys were using our settlement as a model for challenging similar patterns of behavior, and several major aerospace companies had quietly revised their post-acquisition personnel practices to avoid the legal exposure that Excelsior had faced. The professional community that had seemed so divided and politically charged during my struggle with Excelsior was beginning to demonstrate that corporate accountability and business success weren't mutually exclusive. Companies that prioritized merit-based advancement and transparent leadership development were attracting the most talented engineers and researchers, while organizations that relied on political considerations for personnel decisions were struggling to maintain technical competence and innovation capacity. Looking back on the experience now, I realized that my fight against corporate discrimination wasn't just about personal vindication or individual justice. It was about preserving the kind of workplace culture that allows technical excellence to flourish, where innovations emerge from collaborative problem-solving rather than political maneuvering, and where experienced professionals can contribute their expertise without fear of systematic exclusion based on demographics or corporate politics. The aerospace industry, like many technical fields, depends on the accumulated knowledge and experience of professionals who have spent decades developing expertise that can't be easily replaced or replicated. When corporate practices systematically exclude those professionals for reasons unrelated to performance or capability, the entire industry suffers from reduced innovation, increased technical risks, and diminished competitive capacity. The struggle I experienced at Meridian was ultimately about more than age discrimination or corporate politics. It was about the fundamental question of whether technical excellence and professional integrity would continue to be valued in an industry that was becoming increasingly dominated by financial considerations and corporate consolidation. The legal victory was important, but the real success was demonstrating that professionals who stand up for principles can not only survive corporate retaliation but can thrive in environments that appreciate their courage and expertise. The lessons I learned during those difficult months have shaped my approach to leadership and professional development in ways that extend far beyond my individual career. When I speak to engineering students or early career professionals, I emphasize the importance of documentation, the value of building diverse professional networks, and the necessity of standing up for principles even when it's difficult and expensive. But I also share the message that corporate discrimination and workplace injustice are not inevitable features of professional life. Companies and leaders who prioritize merit-based advancement, transparent communication, and collaborative problem-solving create environments where everyone can contribute their best work. The challenge is recognizing those environments and supporting the leaders who create them, while also holding accountable the organizations and executives who prioritize political considerations over professional excellence. The phone call that changed everything came on a Tuesday morning in March, exactly 3 years after my legal settlement with Excelsior. I was in my office at Pinnacle, reviewing proposals for our latest smart materials contract, when Elena Rodriguez knocked on my door with an expression that immediately told me something significant was happening. "Rebecca, I just got off the phone with the board," she said, closing the door behind her with unusual care. "We need to talk about an opportunity that I think you'll find interesting." Elena explained that Meridian Aerospace, my former company, was in serious financial trouble. The Excelsior management practices that had prioritized political alignment over technical excellence had led to a series of contract failures, cost overruns, and quality problems that were threatening the company's survival. 2 major military contracts had been terminated for performance failures, and several commercial customers had switched to competitors after experiencing delivery delays and technical problems that would have been unthinkable under the previous leadership structure. The Excelsior board has decided to divest Meridian rather than continue investing in a turnaround that isn't working, Elena continued. They're looking for an acquisition partner who can restore technical credibility and repair customer relationships that have been damaged by 3 years of management failures. She paused, studying my expression as the implications became clear. Pinnacle has been approached about acquiring Meridian's Advanced Systems division, and the board wants you to lead the due diligence process. The irony was staggering. The company that had systematically excluded me from strategic decisions was now potentially going to be acquired by the company where I had rebuilt my career, and I was being asked to evaluate whether the division I had originally built was worth purchasing. The technical teams I had trained, the innovations I had championed, and the manufacturing processes I had developed were all part of the assets being offered for sale. But Elena's next revelation was even more surprising. "Rebecca, there's something else you should know. The Meridian board has asked specifically whether you would consider returning as CEO if we complete the acquisition. They recognize that you understand the technology, the customers, and the operational challenges better than anyone else, and they believe you're the only person who can restore the company's reputation in the aerospace community." The conversation that followed was unlike anything I had experienced in my 30-year career. Elena and I discussed the possibility of not just returning to my former workplace, but returning as the senior executive responsible for rebuilding everything that had been damaged by the corporate practices I had fought against. The position would require leading the same people who had watched my marginalization without speaking up, working with customers who had witnessed my professional persecution, and restoring technical standards that had been compromised by leaders who valued political loyalty over engineering excellence. "I need time to think about this," I told Elena, recognizing that this decision would define not just my career trajectory but my personal and professional identity for years to come. This isn't just about a job opportunity. It's about whether I want to spend the next phase of my career proving that the technical and leadership approaches they rejected were actually correct. That evening, I called Sarah Kim to discuss the legal and practical implications of potentially returning to Meridian in a leadership role. "Rebecca, this is unprecedented," she said, after I explained the acquisition opportunity. "I've never seen a situation where someone who successfully sued for wrongful termination was offered the CEO position at their former company. It's either the ultimate vindication or a setup for the most complicated professional situation imaginable." Sarah's analysis highlighted both the opportunities and the risks. As CEO, I would have the authority to implement the leadership practices and technical standards that had been dismantled under Excelsior management. I could restore the collaborative culture that had made Meridian successful, rebuild relationships with customers who valued technical excellence over political considerations, and create advancement opportunities for the technical professionals who had been marginalized or excluded. But I would also be inheriting a company with damaged reputation, demoralized workforce, and operational problems that would require years to fully address. The financial resources needed for turnaround would be substantial, and success would depend on convincing aerospace customers that Meridian could once again deliver the technical excellence and innovation that had made it successful before the Excelsior acquisition. "The question," Sarah concluded, "is whether you want to spend the next decade of your career rebuilding something that was deliberately destroyed, or whether you'd prefer to continue building something new at Pinnacle." She reminded me that my current position offered security, professional satisfaction, and the opportunity to pursue innovative research without the political complications of corporate turnaround situations. Over the next 2 weeks, I conducted the due diligence evaluation that would determine whether Pinnacle should acquire Meridian's Advanced Systems division. The process was emotionally complex, because it required me to objectively assess the value of work I had originally created, teams I had trained, and innovations I had championed. Walking through the Meridian facilities for the first time in 3 years felt like visiting a place I had known in a previous life, familiar but fundamentally changed by experiences that had transformed both the organization and my relationship to it. The technical assessment confirmed what Elena and I had suspected. The engineering talent was still exceptional, but the management structure imposed by Excelsior had created inefficiencies and communication problems that were preventing the teams from performing at their previous levels. Quality control processes had been modified to meet corporate compliance requirements that actually reduced effectiveness, and the collaborative culture that had driven innovation had been replaced by hierarchical decision-making that slowed development cycles and reduced creative problem-solving. More importantly, conversations with current Meridian employees revealed widespread recognition that the Excelsior management approach had failed, and that technical leadership was necessary for the company's survival. Jennifer Hawkins, who had left for Pinnacle but maintained relationships with former colleagues, arranged informal discussions with senior engineers who confirmed that morale problems and talent retention issues were threatening the viability of ongoing projects. "Rebecca, we need someone who understands what made this place special and has the authority to restore it," explained Marcus Rodriguez, who had remained at Meridian despite multiple offers from competitors. "The current management doesn't understand aerospace engineering culture, and they've created systems that work against technical excellence rather than supporting it." The acquisition negotiations were completed in 6 weeks, with Pinnacle purchasing Meridian's Advanced Systems division for significantly less than its historical value, a reflection of the damage that 3 years of inappropriate management had created. But the real negotiation was Elena's offer for me to lead the combined organization as president and CEO, with full authority to restructure operations, rebuild corporate culture, and restore technical standards that would make the company competitive again. "Rebecca, this is your opportunity to prove that technical excellence and collaborative leadership aren't just nice theories, they're business strategies that create value and competitive advantage," Elena said as we finalized the leadership transition plan. "You have the chance to demonstrate that the workplace culture you fought for isn't just morally right, it's economically superior to the corporate practices that nearly destroyed this company." The decision to accept the CEO position was ultimately about more than personal vindication or professional advancement. It was about the opportunity to implement on a large scale the leadership principles and technical standards that I had always believed were necessary for sustainable success in aerospace engineering. The chance to rebuild teams, restore customer relationships, and create innovations that would benefit the entire industry was worth the personal and professional risks of taking responsibility for a complicated turnaround situation. My first day as CEO of the newly reconstituted Meridian Aerospace was simultaneously familiar and surreal. I was sitting in the same executive conference room where David Morrison had delivered news of my marginalization, but now I was leading the strategic planning session that would determine the company's future direction. The desert sunlight streaming through those floor-to-ceiling windows illuminated a completely different kind of meeting, one focused on technical innovation, collaborative problem-solving, and merit-based advancement rather than political alignment and corporate compliance. The management team I assembled included several former Meridian engineers who had left during the Excelsior period, Pinnacle researchers who brought expertise in advanced materials, and new hires from throughout the aerospace industry who were attracted by the opportunity to work in an environment that prioritized technical excellence. Jennifer Hawkins returned as Vice President of Engineering, Marcus Rodriguez became Director of Materials Research, and Dr. Sarah Chen, my original mentor, agreed to serve as Senior Technical Advisor despite her official retirement. The first 90 days were focused on what I called cultural rebuilding the collaborative relationships, transparent communication, and innovation-focused environment that had made Meridian successful before the acquisition. We eliminated the hierarchical approval processes that had slowed decision-making, restored direct communication between engineering teams and customers, and implemented performance evaluation systems based on measurable contributions to technical excellence and business success. The results exceeded our most optimistic projections. Within 6 months, we had secured 3 major contracts that had been lost during the Excelsior period, and our customer satisfaction ratings had improved from below industry average to among the highest in aerospace manufacturing. More significantly, our technical teams were developing innovations at a pace that attracted attention from throughout the industry, creating competitive advantages that allowed us to win contracts based on capability rather than price. The turnaround success attracted media attention that focused on the narrative of returning to rebuild something that had been deliberately damaged. Business publications wrote about the case as an example of how corporate culture affects business performance, and industry analysts cited our experience as evidence that technical expertise and collaborative leadership create sustainable competitive advantages in knowledge-based industries. But the real satisfaction came from creating opportunities for professionals who had been marginalized or excluded by corporate practices that prioritized politics over performance. We hired several senior engineers who had faced age discrimination at other companies, promoted women and engineers of color to leadership positions based on technical excellence, and created mentorship programs that ensured experienced professionals could share knowledge with early career engineers. 2 years after taking the CEO position, Meridian was recognized as the fastest-growing aerospace company in our market segment, with innovations in smart materials and adaptive systems that were setting industry standards for performance and reliability. We had restored customer relationships that had taken decades to build originally, recruited top technical talent from throughout the industry, and created a workplace culture that was studied by business schools as an example of how technical excellence and collaborative leadership support each other. The success wasn't just measured in financial metrics or business growth, though both were substantial. It was measured in the satisfaction of proving that the workplace culture I had fought for wasn't just personally important, it was a business strategy that created value for customers, opportunities for employees, and innovations that advanced the entire aerospace industry. Standing in my office 5 years after the legal settlement that had seemed like the end of my career at Meridian, I was looking out those same windows at the Sonoran Desert while reviewing plans for expanding our research facilities and adding 200 new engineering positions over the next 3 years. The company that had systematically excluded me for being too young and lacking strategic vision was now being led by someone who had proven that technical expertise, collaborative leadership, and professional integrity weren't obstacles to business success. They were the foundation for sustainable competitive advantage in industries that depend on innovation and excellence. The transformation wasn't just professional, it was personal validation that standing up for principles, even when it's difficult and expensive, can lead to outcomes that exceed what seems possible when you're in the middle of fighting for your professional survival. The corporate discrimination that had seemed so destructive and insurmountable had ultimately created opportunities to demonstrate leadership capabilities and implement cultural changes that wouldn't have been possible under different circumstances. Looking back on everything that happened, the systematic exclusion, the legal battle, the industry challenges, and the ultimate vindication, I realized that the most important lesson wasn't about corporate accountability or employment law. It was about the importance of believing that technical excellence and professional integrity create value that eventually gets recognized, even when it takes longer and costs more than anyone anticipates. When young engineers ask me for career advice, I tell them that workplace injustice and corporate discrimination are real problems that require courage and persistence to address. But I also tell them that companies and leaders who prioritize merit-based advancement, transparent communication, and collaborative problem-solving create opportunities for everyone to contribute their best work. The challenge is recognizing those environments, supporting the people who create them, and sometimes having the courage to fight for the principles that make them possible. The aerospace industry, like all technical fields, succeeds when experience and innovation work together to solve complex problems that matter for society. That requires workplace cultures where age is valued as expertise rather than treated as liability, where diverse perspectives are sought rather than excluded, and where technical excellence is the primary criterion for advancement and recognition. My experience at Meridian, both the discrimination I faced and the leadership opportunity I eventually earned, taught me that individual professionals have more power than they often realize to influence corporate culture and industry standards. Sometimes that power requires legal action and public accountability. Sometimes it requires building alternative organizations that demonstrate better approaches. And sometimes it requires taking on leadership responsibilities to prove that the principles you fought for can actually work in practice. The story that began with being told I was too young for promotion ended with leading the same company as CEO and proving that the technical expertise and collaborative leadership they had rejected were exactly what was needed for business success. But the real outcome wasn't personal vindication. It was the demonstration that workplace cultures based on merit, integrity, and technical excellence aren't just morally preferable, they're competitively superior to organizations that prioritize politics over performance. If you've experienced workplace discrimination, been passed over for promotions you clearly deserved, or watched less qualified people advance while you were told to wait your turn, I want you to know that standing up for yourself isn't career suicide, it's career development. Document everything. Seek legal counsel when necessary. And remember that companies and leaders who value technical excellence and professional integrity are looking for people who have the courage to fight for those principles. The aerospace industry needs experienced professionals who understand that innovation comes from collaboration, that diversity of thought improves problem solving, and that technical excellence requires workplace cultures where merit determines advancement. Whether you're starting your career, fighting discrimination, or leading organizational change, remember that your expertise and integrity create value that eventually gets recognized by the people and organizations that matter. Thank you for watching, and please let me know in the comments if you've experienced similar workplace challenges, or if you've found companies that truly value technical excellence and professional development. Subscribe if you want to hear more stories about fighting corporate discrimination and building workplace cultures that support innovation and advancement based on merit rather than politics. Your career, your expertise, and your professional integrity matter more than any individual company or corporate structure, and there are always opportunities to create or find environments where those qualities are valued and rewarded. Remember, excellence is always recognized eventually, but sometimes you have to fight for the recognition, and sometimes you have to build the organizations where excellence can flourish. Either way, your career belongs to you, and you have more power than you realize to shape it according to your values and principles.